All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Free to land, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Black Ecology series, part 2. I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about myself and MXGM in general. So I am Sacharja Cunningham. I'm a scholar, poet, and organizing member of the Philly chapter of the Malcolm X Grassroots movement. So next slide, please. So who are we? The Malcolm X Grassroots Movement is an organization of Africans in America, New Africans, whose mission is to defend the human rights of our people and promote self-determination in our community. We understand that the collective institutions of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism have been at the root of our people's oppression. So we organize around 6 principles. We support human rights, we demand reparations, we promote self-determination, we oppose genocide, we organize to free all political prisoners, and we organize to end gender and sexual oppression. And our work can be categorized into these 6 areas. We do a lot of political prisoner work. We focus on self-defense and working with youth. We have a lot of international work, and we do work around gender and sexual justice, and then, of course, land, food, and climate. All right, so I'm gonna hand it off to Jayana.
Hi, everybody. So the Land, Food, and Climate Committee utilizes a Black Ecologies framework, recognizing that the harm of settler colonialism on land, the natural environment, foodways, and relations to land, while recognizing the ways new African people have navigated and lived with land since our arrival at Turtle Island and before, in acknowledging pre-colonial African and indigenous land relations. And I'll pass it to Angel to talk about gender and sex.
Pronouns, and I'm an organizer with the DC chapter of the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. And the Gender Justice Committee, we are a working committee that upholds the work of the 6th principle. Our purpose is to ground the work of shaping the culture of MXGM that relates to the concerns of new African genders and sexualities, and also educating our communities and those who are interested in freeing the land on different oppressions that affect and impact folks, new African folks of all genders as well as sexual orientations. And I will pass it to Srikaja. LOL, just kidding. Overall, this committee seeks to demonstrate our commitment to the 6th principle by not treating the principle as the responsibility of women or new Africans oppressed based on gender and sexuality. Instead, regardless of gender and sexuality, we are committed to lead the charge against patriarchal violence and move work with our new African siblings who are oppressed on the basis of gender and sexuality. Next slide. As a grounding measure, MXGM benefits from embodying gender and sexual-based analytics. Oh my gosh, what is going on with my speech? To understand how to support new Africans and as a way to develop critiques of settler colonial impositions of anti-Blackness, patriarchy, sex, gender, and sexuality. This committee uses the political frameworks of Black queer feminism, Black transness, Black queerness, womanism, reproductive justice, Black ecologies, gender anarchism, disability, and sexual and libidinal economies. And I will pass it to Srikaja.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Angel. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Black ecologies and the series. And to start off, we can talk about what Black Ecologies is. So Black Ecologies explores the historical and contemporary relationships between Black people, land, and the environment. Black Ecologies understands the relationship between anti-Blackness, the exploitation of nature and ecological crisis, and the imperative of racial justice to environmental justice. Black Ecologies does not only hope to understand historic and current existential crises experienced by Black people and the environment, but also encompasses a liberatory vision for freeing the land and the people where we conceive of futures outside of destruction. Next slide, please. Okay, so today I will be in conversation with JT Roane, and this is part 2 of the Black Ecologies series. We had part 1, and this is an ongoing process of engaging with a lot of these themes and topics. So I will speak a little bit more about JT and yes, okay, perfect. All right. So JT Roane is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Geography and the Andrew W. Mellon Chair in Global Racial Justice in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University, and he is a 2008 graduate of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. His book, Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place, was published in 2023 with New York University Press. Roane's experimental film Plot received support from Princeton's Crossroads Fellowship. He also currently serves as a member of Just Harvest Tidewater, an Indigenous and Black-led organization building toward food sovereignty and justice in Virginia's historical plantation region through political and practical education. All right, so welcome everyone, and welcome JT to the conversation.
Thank you. Looking forward.
All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. We have some guiding questions for the first part of the event, and then we'll get into Q&A later on. So to start off, the first question is, just to tell me more about yourself, JT, and what brought you to this work. What is your intellectual and movement lineage?
Thank you. Again, I'm honored to be in conversation with you all, especially about this topic. I want to say, I guess, as way of introduction, I grew up in a milieu of resistance cultures, of everyday resistance cultures, of mutual aid, but also of fighting back in certain ways. I grew up in Tidewater, Virginia, a small town called Tappahannock, Virginia. And, I think looking back over the kind of gaps in memory and time and nostalgia and all that, can honestly say that especially my father's mother and her siblings provided the kind of real first milieu of like everyday like intra-communal support for one another. And I think I had to sort of start with that and naming it, because that part of Virginia is defined by a history of violence and displacement and across generations in relation to Black people having, having several displacements that are tied to ecological violence. And we could talk more about that. But from slavery to Jim Crow enclosures to around the 90s and 2000s industrialization, and now with sort of Green Horizon, it's an extremely vulnerable place, like many rural Black communities. I grew up in that context and in that lineage, and I wanted to name that. I think part of my intellectual and my political journey comes out of my time in high school, just really thinking with environmental studies and environmental sciences at a governor's school context in Virginia. Me not knowing that what that even meant, other than perhaps a better chance for attending university. But it laid the seeds. I had really good teachers in that context, and it laid the seeds for a certain kind of just baseline understanding of ecological catastrophe, although because it was so confined within the sciences, not have any sense at the time that had anything to do with me or Black histories or whatever. And that changed when I got to the University of Virginia. I went there for undergrad, and my second year, I went like many folks thinking, I had working class parents, so thinking that I would get there and be a doctor or a lawyer or something else that would be potentially lucrative directly. And my second year, Katrina happened. I was an undergrad. I remember walking into my dorm and seeing on TV what was happening, not having any language, any way to process what was happening, to just seeing us left on rooftops to die. But that experience of shock wasn't, I don't think that would have been enough. Claudrina Harold, Dr. Claudrina Harold, who was a professor there, who started around the same time I did as a assistant professor, and at that time in Black Studies and History, you know, brought me into helping to plan a benefit for Katrina that invited people like Raheem Islam and folks who were on the ground doing mutual aid and all that in the context of directly after Katrina. Um, and that was like a opening to my sort of politicization, I think, in a direct way, and my study. And those things, I think, is critical to say that they came together. And I was further nurtured in that context through living wage campaign and other stuff that was going on at UVA at that time, by folks like Dr. Wendy Marshall, who introduced me to like Marxist thought, also James Cone and those, and radical Black theologians, which was critical for me because I was religious in a particular way at that time, that probably tended towards a certain kind of conservatism. But that context drew me into reading and thinking differently. Eventually, I went to the Center for Third World Organizing, which at that time used to have, and they still do, the Movement Activist Apprenticeship Program. And I went to Oakland for a week, and then you dropped into a active campaign, which is which is a lot. But we were organizing taxi drivers, primarily East African taxi drivers in that context, who were fighting slavery wages and just mistreatment. And at that time, most of them were East African, a lot of them were Muslim or even perceived as Muslims. And, you know, Tennessee at the time was leading the way in terms of mosque burnings and other kinds of like racist and xenophobic attacks, at the legislature, but also like just in the mob sense. And so that was part of it. But in that context, I really met educators. I met educators who were also organizers, and that drew me into a particular vision. From there, I thought I would get into graduate school the first time I applied, and I didn't. So I went home and I taught adult ed. Um, and I think partially, you know, through the MAP people really getting into it with those folks who saw themselves as educators and as organizers, and that being the classroom as a site of organizing, youth organizing. And then I think, you know, I went to graduate school, and continued to do work, and at a certain point was working with young people, but also in that context and just after experience like losses, a series of losses, both my father, my home church blew away, certain other things that continue to like amplify the like relationship between um, Black people not being free and the land not being free, and the ecological consequences of that. And that's led me most recently to doing Just Harvest, which we found each other. Jay Richardson Grebe, Chad Lewis, and Reverend Cornelius Holmes and I kind of found each other all doing kind of silo work around food and land in different ways. Reverend Holmes was the most advanced in his work because right after they basically took their vegetable ministry at First Baptist Tappahannock and expanded it to the understanding during COVID that we were all sick and shut in to as an organizing tool, I would call it. I'm not sure that they would name it in that way, but as an organizing tool and as just a way of keeping community and making sure the elders and everybody was okay. Jay is a Rappahannock woman, indigenous. That's their land, historically stewarded land. Um, and I think, and she was, you know, she's already doing stuff around the soil and intergenerational transfers between indigenous peoples within their genealogies. And then Chad is a white anti-violence organizer, and then there's me, and my approach in many ways has come to studying the land like legally and otherwise, stuff that I, you know, have some training and familiarity with, or can build training and familiarity with to do political education around land. And that's kind of where we are. So I appreciate that question, just to explore the kind of genealogy that brings both movement wise and and study wise, what brings me to where I'm at. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, because you shared so much, like rich details around sort of political context, with your experiences with Katrina, and then the intimate stories of you and your family and where you grew up. And I think we really get to see sort of all of the different elements that go into someone's radicalization and political um consciousness raising. And one of the lines that stood out to me, as a fellow educator, is seeing the classroom as a side of organizing. So I really appreciate that. And I think you also gave us a lot of insight into, you know, what we mean by Black ecologies, which is a very like expansive framework. And I think hearing the specifics around your experience helps us like really ground it. And that really leads us into the next question. I know I spoke a little bit about this in the introduction, and there's a lot that we can say about this, but in your words, what is Black ecologies, and how do you envision Black ecologies incorporated into movement work?
Thank you. I think for me, Black Ecologies names a way of understanding, just as a baseline rubric, the vulnerability and the genealogies of certain things. Like I think we'll get into this in the conversation later, but something like the so-called Anthropocene, recognizing the anti-Black routes and roots of that, um, deploying critical Black studies thought to the problem of so-called climate crisis or climate emergency, or whatever we're calling it at a particular moment. And I think also mobilizing the resources, the intellectual and organizing histories and resources of Black communities to really um, challenge those conditions in a fundamental way, and um, not simply reproduce the kind of visions that are rampant in environmental studies, whether that's in the sciences or whether that's in the humanities or the social sciences, or whether that's in everyday like discussions of it, journalistic and otherwise, or liberal like organizing even work that still holds out that certain populations of people, certain places, certain populations of non-people are expendable. I think I think also for me, it invokes the necessity of broad broad connections and categories across history and other things that can bring us together. But as translation, as a complex set of negotiations, because we inhabit different structural positions within all of that. I think also just it's an invitation to think with, again, with the rich genealogy and resources of Black studies about these problems, because I think we're isolated out from sort of certain discussions, like even radical ones like political ecology. Black studies is only spottily ever engaged or read or thought in those spaces. And I think that has real political consequences, because I think we miss the opportunity at seeing, for example, enslaved resistance, civil rights, Black power in this U.S. context, but all kinds of various contexts, Caribbean histories, Haitian histories, histories on the continent, as actually bearing out, one, the backstory for how we got here, but also really, again, providing critical insights about how to challenge this, how to think differently about other kinds of possibilities for a future. Um, and all of that. And so for me, it functioned as kind of like I think we talked about this more in our kind of informal conversation, but to evoke self-defense, it was like the bat signal, because I think we were all kind of isolated doing something that, doing different kinds of approaches to these kinds of questions, but being told within different disciplines and in different movement spaces that we didn't really have nothing to say, that Black people don't want to care about the environment, or that it's not, or at best that we're victims of it, and that's it. That we don't have a rich tradition. I think we have a rich tradition of spatial thought and practice and environmental thought and practice that says otherwise. How do I envision it being incorporated into movement work? I think it can be a mode of study and theory that underwrites that, and that helps us to appreciate already the kind of resources that we already mobilize in a day-to-day way to survive. At least in relative scarcity, we're talking about in the US context, quite often the kind of, you know, fake austerity that's produced here through revanchism and violence and all of that is resonant across territory. And um, I think we need to study that and think about that. And I think we need to incorporate analyses across those different genealogies, rich genealogies into our practices. So yeah, I think that's the primary thing for me, is a mode of study and a mode of contemplation and all of that, that brings together the histories and the present, movement work in one praxis.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. I like the naming of it as like a bat signal and an invitation. Because I think there's just so much need for coordination. And you talked about like, people doing work in silos and what does it mean to you know, create a collective effort around a lot of these issues and challenges. And I think you know, another thing that came to mind was the centrality of study. And I personally joined MXGM for its focus on study and political education. And that's at the heart of like also what I want to do as not only an educator, but as someone who's constantly needing to learn about a lot of this. So I appreciate you talking about Black ecologies and a lot of your work, because I know I'm a student of the framework in a lot of ways. And yeah, that's going to take us into our next question, because in thinking about your work, I'm drawn to the Black Ecologies Field School in Virginia. And I'm drawn to it because I think it represents how we can think expansively about pedagogies across different settings, outside the classroom in particular. So, doing study outdoors on the land and in other spaces. So can you speak more about the field school and how does it relate to what Black education alongside Black ecologies can and should look like?
Yeah, thank you. I think for me the Black Ecologies Field School gathering is part of the ongoing kind of collaborative work that I've been doing with my co-conspirator Justin Hosby, as well as some other folks in a kind of loose collective of people working around Black ecologies. Like Justin and I, um, the first time I think I wrote that formulation out of Nathan Hare and other folks actually wrote Black Ecologies, or Black Ecology was in collaborative work with Justin to just think across our different regions, really to think across Virginia and Southeast Louisiana, the histories, both of their linked history from the slave trade up through petrochemicals, right? Because of course, Richmond and New Orleans are the biggest ports in 1860 for the opposite reason. Richmond is selling enslaved people, and New Orleans is buying, and up through the Mississippi. But also now, with what is generated through petrochemicals, to maintain a certain kind of ownership of the land, the settler vision for the land, um, the stuff that's produced in so-called Cancer Alley and other spaces is then in turn sprayed back onto communities. So I think in Virginia, so I think I think for us, it was about trying to find a way to open up those kinds of relationships, as well as the shared relationships of resistances in particular, and the ways that they take on a different frame in the region, and also with the necessity of understanding that the region is not um like it has to be, there's translation work even at that level of intra Black dialogue about ecologies because of different structural relationships again. So I think Um, I think when we started doing, we went into it thinking in that frame. And I think the last year we gathered and Just Harvest hosted about 40 folks doing Black ecologies and indigenous ecologies and food justice that ran a range of media. So there was a gallery opening with about 5 or 10 artists, from young people to to elders. There was music and all of that, and dance, both indigenous dance and like hip hop dance, with young people, um, film screenings and other things. And it was just a way of us being able to have um, Black and indigenous ecologies conversations in a way that's public and open, and also that shifts our collective understanding about place. Again, what I was saying before, again, we may talk more about this, but critiques of climate discussions, one of the major issues is that the kind of global emergency framework um, catapults us very quickly to a mile high in the sky or more, a planetary outlook that is dangerous, and given the tendencies of gender racial capitalist global and state orders, um, is murderous. It will be murderous and genocidal and ecocidal. That's its natural tendency, and nothing should suggest that a new emergency will make that different. Like that we should trust the virtue of that on site as if it's like given. So, and I think places like my home community, I'm sitting here now with deeds and looking at it. There was a major buy-off in 2008, after 2008, from what had been local timber interests to multinationals in the name of green futures. John Hancock Insurance Company, all these things that they're actually tied to Canadian multinationals. So if we put their land profiles together, they probably own land here, there, and every damn where, right? And they're buying it up in the name of carbon, carbon sequestration. At best, they're like loblolly monoculture, non-forest tree plantations, right? So it's a fantasy that they're like some major carbon sink in a way that a full actual like forest might be. So I think how do we come to think about those kinds of things, and also the alternatives, um, is I think in ways that go beyond my ability to look at this or that or yours or somebody else's ability to know a part of it, is to come together and to do that with culture. I come from, I would say another part of my genealogy I didn't mention before, is they used to have at the Highlander the Zilphia Horticultural Organizing Institute, um, Tafara, Walla Muhammad, and Ebony Golden and other folks put on this training. And my other training in organizing was like, how many doors did you knock on? How many people did you survey today? And their approach was like slow, like cultural organizing is slow. And I think, I sometimes, I mean, the climate is like, we both need to be urgent and like the other slower form. So bringing us together in the field school is like about first of all, activating us all to that the climate emergency and the ecological crisis is an all hands on deck effort. Like young people are the main ones the people that regulating all of this gonna be dead. They don't care. You know what I'm trying to say? They don't even care about their own kids or their own grandkids. But that's another, and I don't even mean in the literal biological sense. I just mean generational progeny. They couldn't care less. Um, but young people are the people that have to be activated. And recognize that all of our various kind of like powers need to be brought into this. And I think that that's why we joined up in the kind of field school model. Is like, how do we go and be and know and share together in ways that are transformative? we'll gather this year, I would say also that last year included a number of like field spaces that were about the histories of like, we went to the second oldest Black church that was founded through, all those churches in Virginia were founded through independent post-emancipation Black small-scale cultivation of the land and collective working of the land and the waterways and oysters and all of that. So those buildings themselves are literally embodiments of, in fact, I've been trying to think about how some of the more rural country churches that are still all wood really were built at the time that of a major clearing of the forest in that area right after emancipation. So they themselves are an archive of like that clearing. So anyway, learn it together. And we'll go to New Orleans hosted by Dr. Justin Holsby this year to meet with folks who are engaged with what all these things mean in that context. So and cross-pollinating between those. So it's easy for me to go back and forth as a mobile academic to hop around, but to make sure that Just Harvest and other and some of the educators that participated last summer with us locally will also go to New Orleans, so that we're moving in that way. And Tiana Williams, who runs the Black Ecologies Lab with me, will do another one in Winona, Mississippi, with an organization there, and take people again. So trying to move around, but also cross-pollinate as a way of understanding local and the histories of local stuff that are required for us to maintain that local capacity and sense of community that could be obliterated by global climate crisis, but also building meaningful scale. Like we also can't afford to understand or to have any of ourselves understand that you can protect or save or build a new world in one small isolated community. So doing both. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that so much. I think there were so many different gems and takeaways. You know, I really love in the field you know, written
And
text or anything like that, theory, but also dance and music and film. And part of my appreciation is really rooted in the fact that, you know, I've been mostly in the Northeast all of my life. So learning about how your work is really cross context, and you talk about being mobile, and I think it's helpful to see the connections and make those connections around these different contexts. Um, and I also really just appreciated of like your point about slow organizing. And there's definitely a lot of urgency that comes up with a lot of these issues of land, food, climate. But I do think having that perspective and, you know, being as intentional and thoughtful as possible is important. And I appreciated how you also, um, you know, talked about like the climate crisis, and that I think that gets into our next question, question 4. And, you know, you've briefly touched on this already, discussing, you know, this idea of the Anthropocene, which is, you know, something that's relatively new to me. Um, so as we get into it, if we could share the slides that we have, and we'll talk a little bit more about, you know, what the Anthropocene is. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so, you know, the Anthropocene, thinking of that, you know, it being the name of this current geological age where human activity is named as, you know, the driving factor of climate change experienced on a global scale. So thinking about things like the Industrial Revolution and the rise of manufacturing and technological progress, and those as cited as the beginning of this age. And there's a quote here, and then we also get like a visual of what that looks like. So the quote saying, considering these and many other major and still growing impacts of human activities on Earth and atmosphere, and at all, including global scales, it thus is more than appropriate to emphasize the central role of mankind in geology and ecology by using the term Anthropocene for the current geological epoch. I guess I could say, initially I have a lot of resistance to this sort of framework and analysis, because I think it reflects what I'm noticing as a sort of dominant and limiting way of defining human, and sort of conflating human with a lot of the history of like colonization. And I'm thinking about how, in whether it means scholarship or, pop culture media. I was even watching a documentary about just a nature documentary, and it touched on climate crisis, but it sort of like generalizes it like, humans in general have had this negative impact on, the environment. And I think that really eclipses a lot of what colonial beings and colonizers have done. And it erases the histories of harm and how colonized populations have and continue to live with the land. So I'm, excited for this question because I'm interested in disrupting that singular view and framing of the human and the human race. And then I think, that gets into the Negrocene. So the Negrocene is an alternative name put forth by Malcolm Ferdinand in his book, Decolonial Ecology. And it acknowledges the Industrial Revolution was fueled by extraction of resources and labor from colonized lands and peoples, namely, enslaved Africans via the transatlantic slave trade and the subsequent conquest. So I think it's helpful to have these conflicting views of, this context and, talking more about the Anthropocene. It's reliant on the notion of geological ages. Liberal society engages the Anthropocene as the time during which humans have had a substantial impact on our climate. Similar to the considerations of the Negrocene, the notions of the human time and impact would have to be differently assessed. For example, the Anthropocene begins within settler society around the period of the Industrial Revolution, which is, between the 18th and 19th centuries. However, relations between people and the land must be reevaluated as settlers determined who was and was not human. So here are some other quotes really interrogating this idea of like the human. So do you realize what is happening? You have people who are the real humans and then people of color who are the others. And that's from Sylvia Wynter, Proud Flesh Interviews. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that really gets us to this idea of the human. In the realm of the human, whiteness becomes the default. And there's man one, which marks the period of the late 15th European Renaissance era through 18th century, which recognizes a political self beginning. And man two, which emerges to replace the political self as a feature that centers bioeconomic modes of being. And this is the order that we exist under today. And this is again from Sylvia Wynter. Next slide. In my reading of Sylvia Wynter's Man 1 and 2, it's not a catch-all phrase for patriarchal colonizers. This means man, the concept, is not enfleshed. Man is a figure, a schema, a projection that expresses and organizes mono-humanism and our collective embodied worlds. And that is from Catherine McKittrick. So I think is, yeah, so more a bit on the Anthropocene. So this is from Catherine Youssef, and they write in A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None that coloniality and anti-Blackness are materially inscribed into the Anthropocene. The earliest suggested date in the history of material exchanges is the 1610 thesis, dating the Anthropocene start to the European invasion of the Americas or the New World, and the so-called exchange in flora and fauna. The 1610 natal moment does, however, tie the origin of the Anthropocene to the death of 50 million indigenous people 80 to 95% of the population, systematic violence, and chattel slavery. And the Anthropocene does not unleash any ethical crisis in liberal discourse about who is targeted by these material practices. What is at stake and what is on the front line are defined through the color line. This is why the Anthropocene is configured in a future tense rather than in recognition of the extinctions already undergone by Black and Indigenous peoples. Following in the wake of humanism, the production of the Anthropocene is predicated on whiteness as the color of universality, while the ethical distinction of humanism rests on the distinction between what is human and what is inhuman. Blackness is established. Next slide, please. Okay. That's it for now, I guess. So I think that context is really helpful in, exposing a lot of the different ways of thinking about quote unquote human impact on the environment. And I really appreciate that we get to sort of talk more about that. So given that context about, colonialism's impact, the Anthropocene, the Negrocene, what are some ways that we can think differently and more accurately about climate change and its relationship to Blackness, land, and labor?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that thorough engagement across those kind of different modes of discussing, you know, with Ferdinand and Yusuf and McKittrick and Sylvia Winter. A couple of things I would like to say. I would like to add Francois Verges and a kind of amended version of her racial capitalist scene to that potential mix of stuff, gender racial capitalist scene, to think about again as another way of opening up the kind of the kind of economic and other kind of foundations of that. I think Negrocene does get at some of that, and I think it does get at particularly um, the production of excess people and excess kinds of natural features. I think that is a sundering of earth. One of the most remarkable lines that Ferdinand includes in that book is about basically where he describes the slave trade, the African slave trade, as the human deforestation of Africa. And I think that's the kind of thinking that it resonates with June Jordan, it resonates across our kind of genealogies to think with stuff like that. So I'm not at all taken away from that formulation. And I do think in some ways what happens with the climate when 1 degree or 1.5 degrees Celsius is 85 times or more additional energy in the atmosphere, that we're talking about we're talking about all hell's fury. And I think we need to really understand that comes out of a genealogy that must include slavery. That's foremost. I think I've spent time at the Institute for Advanced Study last year, or 2 years ago, I guess, and thinking with a lot of like liberal and well-intended and even radical white folks about the environment. And this trips them up every time to have to place that at the center of the conversation. Because I think, again, some of them are very, very well comfortable with placing us as the victims of something called environmental racism, like toxic dumping and all that. But I think to put us at the scene of world historical significance when it comes to these epical designations, they like, we're not doing all of that. So that's one. I think it's internal to the academy, which I think I say all this shaking up, epistemological shaking up is required, because I think to extend, take perhaps too many liberties. But I think with Winter, we're at least at man 3 at this point. I think we live in a new epoch. I think digitalization, the increase in micromolecular understanding of life after the human genome, and post-lunar space exploration that press the horizon of what is considered the domain of man. I think we're at a epochal new designation that's required. And I think the climate emergency is a part of that declaration. So I think the soft, humanistic, and social scientific versions that sound a little less austere than the Malthusian, you know, war making versions of it are really just a different set of clothes over the same man. So I think, and I think that is a third, that's a third, at least a third, if we go with that designation. I think so that's why I think the stakes of like a Black studies critique, Black ecologies critique and praxis in that point, alongside alongside indigenous around the world, you know, America's indigenous, but also indigenous around the world formulations, um, critiques of what it has been and what it is and what it will be are central, in actually making it a decolonial ecology. You know, getting to Ferdinand's vision within the title, because I think we're at a place, again, I've held up those deeds and records where people are, where corporations and corporate interests in the name of green are buying up a whole another layer of land. And if Virginia holds, if the Tidewater Virginia holds, they're buying up land that comes out of a direct plantation like genealogy for just being amassed in that way. They're buying, like, they're literally just building out from that history. And again, that's all in the name of carbon sequestering and this kind of one fantasy horizon that you can pump it without mitigation, carbon into the atmosphere, and then you could just take it out, combining trees and like some techno fantasy of sucking it out of the air. That will undoubtedly create new problems. um, so I think, yeah, I think that's critical. I think also just like not just, I mean, broad categories like slavery and all that, but also in this US context, Jim Crow, but also I think studying Jim Crow in relation to, like, you know, the 1915 invasion of Haiti and other resonant points where literally the horizon is and was and has always been unfree labor. Like, these kinds of emergencies and enclosures have entailed that time and again across especially Black places. So I think we had, especially given what's going on with under the liberal presidency and the threat of the full right wing fascist presidency, what they're already doing with repression. I think we have to really we have to really recognize that the climate emergency is not going anywhere, and that threat is there, and that formula of it is, and I'm thinking with other scholars' work here, but that formulation of it just unleashes so much potential violence and we're already at camps. We're already at at 3 or 4 genocides or more. So yeah, I think we need an injunction against all of that. And I think the Negrocene, racial capitalist scene, these are insurgent discourses in a context in which Anthropocene would just allow the mainstream of the West to just go on with consuming and go on with consuming everybody else.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. It really just strikes me how, you know, there are these various time periods and spaces that need to be in our, you know, framing. Like you described the thread, and yeah, I'm seeing that there's a lot of power in how we think about those different time periods and spaces. And I appreciate how you also, you know, brought in various like international, transnational contexts as well as we're thinking about, you know, what's going on here in the US. Um, and yeah, so I definitely I'm gonna keep, you know, learning more about that because I think that's helpful also when it comes to how we teach about like Black ecologies and, you know, what frameworks we're using to do that work. So we can move to the next question. So this question really ties in a lot of the gender and sexual justice and those aspects of this work. So in Dark Agoras, your book from 2023, you speak about Black people's relationship to space and challenging normative understandings of home, family, the church, and other institutions of settler society. And you talk about this idea of Black queer urbanism. So in thinking about the connections between Black sexual and gender justice and then land, food, and climate justice, we're thinking about also, Black people's relationship to gender and sexuality and how that allows us to embody deviance from, these oppressive norms that are related to space, land, home, geographies, and ecologies. So really thinking about, deviance as resistance and how that comes about not only in how Black people live and resist, but also how it comes about in nature and in different environments. So thinking of your work with Dark Agoras and then also Black ecologies, the question is, how can we use Black ecologies to disrupt colonial understandings of gender and the gender binary and other binaries? So I think one, for example, in Dark Agoras, I believe you disrupt that binary between rural and urban and, Black people as an embodiment of that. So yeah, again, how can we use Black ecologies to disrupt colonial understandings of gender, the gender binary, and other binaries?
Yeah, I think we have to um anarchically and otherwise resist all the kinds of um all the kinds of cages that hold down this particular vision of land and its future, which is really just hell-bent on not only ecocide and genocide, but also ultimately man's own suicide, which is another another part of it that I don't know if I even have the chops to deal with. But I think we have to, and I think first of all, Black queer studies, Black trans studies, his like Black feminist engagements around gender, racialized gender across different kind of disciplinary and practical frameworks are a heavy part of the arsenal of Black ecological resistance. And I think that is on a number of fronts. I think foremost epistemologically, I saw somebody who was invoking eco-womanism and Afro-pessimism together. I think Dolores Williams was saying in the early 90s, a Black theologian and eco-womanist was saying in the 90s the connections between the histories of like sundering Black women's bodies under slavery, and I think strip mining, right? This kind of radical exploitation of the earth. And I think those intellectual resources are shaped by their moment in the ways where Black feminist discourse and womanist discourse was at a particular moment. I think it's our job as custodians of those histories, as stewards of those genealogies and epistemologies, to continuously update them and reimagine them in the context of like the shift in needs. And I think gender is part of the cage. It's one of the primary infrastructures, or in some ways we could see it as a cage in relation to how our ordering of the land, even how we inhabit and reproduce, housing and other things, really centers a particular, these transitional phases between man, like stacked on top of each other and like and interacting with each other in complicated ways that were never meant for us, were extracted for Black people. I think we have to deal with the reality that gender has been an extractive gender, as insofar as it's ever recognized as has been extractive. And I don't think that we shouldn't think that a certain particular opening within liberal discourse for certain kinds of variation and formulations is necessarily dovetails with liberation, because this gender racial capitalism is remarkably adept at taking up. So it's about understanding that as an ongoing dialectic that we have to be a part of. And I think that does, again, that means, we just crossing into Pride Month. It means understanding Essex Hemphill as a Black ecologies theorist when he's writing about poetry about the 90s in DC, and we get a sense of like these particular intense contexts that are syndemic, and how you thinking about a Black queer life in that place. That is a major contribution of Black ecological thought. For as just one example, I think I've been thinking a lot with June Jordan, and her writing and thinking, from about 1970 when she goes to Mississippi. Well, actually after 64, when she witnesses the Harlem riot, so-called Harlem riot, um, she's radicalized, and she goes to Mississippi in 1970 to do a piece on commission with the New York Times Magazine, but like has this whole process that radicalizes her after that, with having actually seen Fannie Lou Hamer in context, really actually trying to make actionable free in the land, and continues to write that, and writes that into, her 2000s moment where she's doing whatever we might want to call posthumanism in a particular way now. She was saying that she was writing essays in 91 and 92 that toggle between anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela and a redwood tree, and seamlessly as one set of entities to be respected with equal reverence. So I think we have a rich genealogy that was not only just like references matters of gender and sexuality, but actually moves through those as powers, as capacities. And I think there are all kinds of modalities that are opened up by Black queer thought and Black queer practice and Black trans studies and all of that I don't, they don't always have to be operationalized directly in relation to the problem of the Anthropocene, but they provide alternative modalities and approaches that we do need. I think, again, I think going back to I think, um, the Green Horizon Man 3 and all this kind of vision, it will proliferate certain forms of like extended, as I would say, articulation of possibility, while it stymies and murders the rest. And I think we have to, our one of the major contributions of Black thought, Black queer studies thought, Black feminist thought, and all of that is minding what that means. So I think anyway, and I don't think there's no Black studies for me without all of those traditions in the first place, or Black ecologies without all those traditions in the first place. It's the work of it. So, and I think, yeah, and I think in terms of like directly, yeah, urban and rural and other things, we have a long tradition of that as well. I mean, I think that runs Cabral to, to a lot of people. Like if we start unpacking out the genealogy and Black political ecology as a way of naming it, we have a lot of contributions for thinking about, Winter's that same Proud Flesh interview, she cites like Carter G. Woodson. You know what I'm trying to say? Carter G. Woodson wrote The Rural Negro in like 1929, 1930. I think there's a genealogy that's foreclosed when um when we don't see that there's a whole Black studies and Black ecologies arsenal that disrupt various kinds of binaries at once. And even at the same time, like multiple disruptions at once. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I think it's just so helpful to know. It's affirming. I think it's hope giving to hear just the abundance of work and the range of work that has been done by the Black queer ancestors. I appreciate how you mentioned Essex Hemphill and June Jordan, and I think they're just so much to study. Going back to that idea of study as a crucial part of Black ecologies and organizations like MXGM. So I appreciate you naming a lot of those resources, and definitely I hope folks are able to look into them more as we're continuing to work through and think about the work of Black ecologies. All right, so we got one more question, and then we'll move into the audience Q&A. So a reminder for folks, if you have any questions that are coming up from the conversation, to drop them into the Q&A feature. All right, so last question, and this is a question that's repeated, throughout the Black Ecology series as we're engaging with folks, and that is, what does free the land mean to you? And I know we've touched on it in some aspects before, but yeah, if you could, just revisit that.
Yeah, I'll talk just to try to be most concrete through what I would hope for something like Just Harvest. And I think it's really to build on the palimpsest of like histories of mutual aid, alternative infrastructures and all that that have been existing. Sometimes things, sometimes you have to like honor spirit. And one of the things that when we just opened a public facing garden a few weeks ago, I started to poke around with my co-collaborators about the history of that particular parcel of land. And we came to realize that it was a church that had a Black church that had splintered off from First Baptist Tabernacle around 1879 and lasted till about 1920. And they had cleared the building and ended up in the town's hands in 1980s. We still got to see about, as my co-collaborator says, Reverend Ho's like, we still got to see about like how they got it. But anyway, we'll leave that part for now. But it pressed me into thinking of with the deeds and all these kinds of things. And um I think we need to fundamentally question the regime of property and all that currently governs the land as a global thing. Because I think again, the kind of tendency and horizon that we're moving towards is enclosure. And then within that, once people are removed, if the kind of historical trajectory and geography of gender racial capitalism is any indication, people are displaced. People are displaced across various kinds of scale of place, and then that facilitates, something that approaches slavery or unfree labor or unfree extractive violence. And this society already has all that. So why wouldn't an emergency make that go into high gear? So I think freeing the land is one, is recognizing that all of that is where we are, and recognizing that we that ain't nothing free about the land. Like nothing. Us and the land is unfree as shit is like a major starting place. And having that knowledge collectively, having that be something that we know collectively. And I think it looks like, for me, building projects that work towards something that we can fight for, that we can defend. I don't think we're in a place in that part of Virginia is, very concretely, we don't own much, and multinationals is buying it up. But we do have a tradition of like, you know, one thing about, I won't go too far into this, and this is not to speaking on Just Harvest's behalf at all, but on my own thinking, it's like governing multinationals land from 5 states away or another country means that you also not there to watch it. So there, and I won't go into that, but I think there are ways that we need to mobilize all of our histories to free the land, to actually ensure that it's free and practical. They can hold titles and then not be in their hands in reality. And I think that's what we need to court. I also think that it would mean freeing the land for all species to have a certain kind of like living sovereignty. Um, and I think we had, yeah, in Philly chapter, you have organizational histories like MOVE and others that have made radical claims around life that extend beyond human life, that we need to adapt and understand for where we are right now in ongoing dialogue, where obviously MOVE is still there, not a foregone thing. But I think we need all hands on deck to imagine what freeing the land looks like. And I think for me, it culminates in something. If there is such a thing as a culmination, it culminates in like federation rather than centralization and violence. So I think it looks like very small scale democratic maneuvering around what tree goes where and how do we maintain a biosphere, and how do we live in that way, and how do we procure food, and how do we distribute that. That's what freeing the land would look like to me, at this juncture, and in ongoing dialogue with a collective, because I don't want to be like I'm saying what friend of land is. But to me, it's a collective process towards something like federation.
Yes, Ashay, thank you. Thank you. And I appreciate the emphasis on all hands being on deck, because I do just think about you know, the again, we talked a lot about scale and, you know, the local all the way up to the global. So it really, going back to the idea of Black ecologies as a bat signal, like we're calling on people to, you know, join us. And in that spirit, you know, in the chat, I hope some of you have seen the call for folks to get involved with MXGM. You know, we're having our national member organization orientation this month. So definitely inviting folks to get involved in that way if you feel called to do so. All right, so thank you again for all of your thoughtful responses to these questions. We're going to now move into the Q&A. So again, if folks have questions coming up based on the conversation, definitely drop them into the Q&A feature. All right, so we have 2 questions so far. I'm gonna read out the first one, and then we can go from there as folks drop more. All right, so first question is, how do you recognize Black ecologies as a nexus for gender and sexual justice? How do you see the theoretical and method offerings in Black ecologies as connected to histories of gender and sexual justice?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kay. I mean, I think there's a kind of full arsenal of gender and sexual justice work that has to be a part of our undergirding baseline praxis when it comes um, to Black ecologies, epistemological work and like practical work. I think, and that takes a range of different approaches. I think there are questions about there's like full robust reproductive justice formulations that if we're going to have reproductive justice, we have to have an earth. That's like baseline. So making those kinds of connections. I think there's critique and criticism of embodiments and all of that need to be mobilized as we reimagine everything about ourselves and our as collectivities in this particular moment outside of our own material dependence on other people's misery. I think we have a rich transnational tradition where that was mobilized sometimes as Black, like what we might understand as queer formulations, sometimes as Black feminist ones that just held a baseline like solidarity with other peoples around the world that is a part of that tradition of directly out of those kinds of offerings. So I think it's myriad. And I think also stuff like mutual aid and all that certain formulations in this context mobilize without engaging like everyday and like again theoretical and other ways that Black communities have engaged in those kind of practices they miss the mark, and we miss the mark if we don't see that, if we need other genealogies that don't point to how we are right here before each other in this context that get us here. So I think there's and also I think critically again in pride challenging even my own reliance on the reproductive as a horizon, challenging that as part of the arsenal, that comes through through cruising other modalities that don't have anything to do with a particularly already stable horizon, and visions of futurity. So I think it's myriad. I think we need all of those contentious and debated and debatable questions on the table and answers on the table, because really are at, as man 3 is recapitulating the violences of man 1 and man 2 and adding to them new technical capacities. We have to think about our full, not to put it only in war metaphors, but our full arsenal. And again, I think that ranges from the practical, how do we feed each other and mutual aid, there have been certain kinds of Black womanist and feminist work into how do we challenge the whole horizon of futurity that comes out of Black, queer, and trans and other thought and study. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you, Kay, for that question. And I I'm thinking about, the simultaneity of looking back at the lineages, the genealogies, the traditions, while also envisioning the futurity and the work being done now, so that all of that happening together. And I appreciate how that a question addressed also like methods and, you know, thinking of like the framework, but also like what are the actual practices that, energize and give life to the framework as it's being practiced in community. And I think that leads into Babu Kwame's question, who says, he loves the sharing and is wondering, what is your suggestion to present your scholarship to our new African masses? Revolutionary change on any level requires engaging our folk, ancestral blessings, and free the land.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it is, one of the things that we done with Just Harvest and through the Black Ecologies Lab is try to create popular education resources that take the conversation one outside, as far outside in far ranging ways outside of like singular scientific and other kinds of discourse to appreciate the issues, but also to put it in context and dialogue with various places and other things. So like the zine that's available on the Black Ecologies Lab website included poetry, it included fiction, short fiction, it included essays, it included interviews, and it included the interviews with Ujamaa in the context of South Africa working on guerrilla gardening, fiction from a Jamaican American writer who's writing about bauxite, but fiction through fiction, bauxite extraction in that context through fiction. A poet in Trinidad that's writing about plastic in the beach and weaving that together with Trinidad's like oil emphasis on oil extraction. So I think, and also video work. I think both at different levels. One is like the kind of practical stuff that documents some of the things that we're doing and puts it together in a way. I've been working with somebody who's Philly based named Jonathan Alexander, who is doing all kinds of work around bringing out film stuff, but also experimental film stuff. I've been working on some experimental stuff and hope to continue stuff that, at least in my home community, has the ability to open up a certain dialogue around place that is a part of this conversation. So I think those are some of the ways for me is like thinking about popular education resources that are that run a range. And I think with the field gathering model as well, we always include young people. We've included middle schoolers and high schoolers in the Virginia one. And we're doing another Just Harvest one in August that will again include educators and young people, K through 12 up through graduate students, in the range of like all of us, with the understanding that intergenerational resources and dialogue are central. A new thing that I've been thinking about with these maps and the land is producing, I mean, with these deeds and titles and stuff that I've been looking at archivally is also producing maps that can just show directly to our people who owns what where and how much what that looks like in a frame of a map that is knowable because it's local. So that's another way that I've been personally thinking about that. But also, I've been in dialogue. I did cultural organizing training, and part of our lab includes people who are performance based and engaging with dance and other things. So activating all the like sensory modes, so that it's not just a simple move from let's not just talk science discourse to let's talk, some, whatever my herma is, that's what I call it, herma, whatever my little isolated discourse, and then but into other things. But we need all of that too. I also think we need unreadable theory and Black studies and Black thought too, as much as we need stuff that translates across that and into like popular readability, I think we need the range of like what it can be. Just because stuff happen in different keys, that doesn't happen in other keys, and we need all those keys. So yeah.
Yeah, that's something that definitely struck me in going through the zine, was the range and the abundance of just how folks can engage with Black Ecology's work. And of course, I'm a bit biased with the poetry, but um yeah, I appreciated just like sitting with the themes in that medium, in that form of engaging with it. And again, going back to what we were talking about with, all hands on deck in that call, definitely thinking, in order for that to be a reality, the accessibility and the popular education has to be there too, for folks to find their way. So definitely going to be thinking about that more and more. All right, you could go to the next question. And this is from Josh, who asked, how do you see the Black Ecologies framework connecting Black struggles around land/environment within the United States to other struggles across the Black Atlantic and the African continent?
Again, I think it opens up a point of translation and possibility through that. Again, with the zine, we try to include people not only who are from places and live here, but also who remain in active work doing their work in those places, and not as a straightforward like people living doing work in the township in South Africa are not doing the same work that we're doing in rural Tappahannock, Virginia. Even though we're both focused on food, it has very different potential consequences, good, bad, and ugly on both ends. And I think we need to understand that that makes it necessary for ongoing dialogue. Those are folks that, I've been in consistent conversation with for years. So it's like that kind of like slow engagement. I do think, again, I think it potentially has the power of like a bat signal that goes beyond. I mean, I think about the ways that Black power means many different things depending on the context, but it was a point of I don't know that right word, but a centering force. And I don't mean in the sense of like centering as in all the powers amassed in one center, but a way of orienting at a particular moment critically towards a set of problems and questions that we all need to address. And I think I think Black ecologies is a way, or whatever you call it. Some people call it abolition ecologies or abolition geographies, or what. I don't have a hold on a particular naming of it. Even wherever you see that kind of work going on, we need to be in translation and dialogue. And I think it's also about um being systematic in our reading and engagement, or trying to be, about other places and other moments and other times that have relevant histories. So Black for Palestine, they had a teach-in about Haiti, and that put me down a hole, which I had studied. I'm a U.S. historian by training, so I had to study some of that stuff, and I'm did Black studies, so I had to know a lot of the stuff in relation to those different modes. But a lot of the emphasis was on the revolutionary period and thinking, and not thinking about into the Duvaliers and all of that moment. And so, really being clear about the necessity as a baseline of like knowing other people's histories, even ones that we think we have some familiarity with, knowing that we have to actually commit to studying and engaging in those kinds of ways, especially if we're living in the U.S. context. And our ignorance can our ignorance often underwrites all kinds of violences. So being accountable to that and knowing all of that, I think, is a critical aspect of it as well. But I think, especially I have had more engagement with the South African context through different formations that I've been in over the years. I've always tried to have some contact with different various like African organizations, but primarily through other people. So it's not like I'm gonna hold you and say like I have that's robustly a thing for me. But I do think I think we have to, I think particularly what's going on in the Sudan and the Congo, for example, bring to the fore the necessity of knowing where we're materially invested in those things, where we're where our lifestyles underwrite those things is a baseline, and organizing around that, and organizing that scale around that is a challenge, especially when you're trying to do, but I think I think it can, at this point, a certain hyper local stuff that we've been trying to do is like, how do you infuse that into political education? Like baseline, a shared understanding that even when we might be doing something that's liberatory here, it might be dependent on somebody else's misery, and particularly somebody else Black's misery. And again, particularly with the situation in the Congo, you know, that's underwriting our ability to be on this call right now. And that's real. We have to deal with that. So anyway.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up those contradictions and considerations. I know my area for growth is that, transnational analysis and framework. So I appreciate what Black Ecologies does with, providing space to connect those dots and the imperative of doing so. Um, yeah, and we could go to the next question. So Al Brooks is asking, can you talk about the intersection of Black ecologies and the land back movement? How do Black people and other people not indigenous to spaces we may live reconcile with the genocides that premise our existence, our presence, sorry.
Again, I think this looks very different in different places, and I'll talk about it in the context of the Tidewater, where actively just harvest is indigenous, Rappahannock, and Black led. I think it's a mode of translation. It's complicated in that part of Virginia, um, primarily because the genealogies between Rappahannock and most of the Powhatan, former Powhatan and renewed Powhatan Confederacy nations are the boundary between Black and indigenous is like a blurry one at best. But that's complicated by the 20s with eugenics laws in Virginia that say either you're on a reservation or you're Black or you're white, that there's no category for indigenous people in that context, which which precipitated the Powhatans, including the Rappahannocks, into a kind of like we're here sort of claims that can also be, I'm not, this isn't a critique because I don't know all of the things, but that in other contexts, I say especially can turn to nativism that is not actually, that is exclusionary, violent, and not necessarily on the progressive end of our transformative collectivities. So I think that, and I think, we do have to go back through the shared histories of like, of different violences, especially in Virginia, that have been staged between us, not of our own making, but nevertheless, even if white people were to disappear out of that space right now, that wouldn't just simply disappear because they're not there anymore. So I think that's another mode of translation that has to be worked out. And I do think because there are claims to, especially to labor-based visions of like our reparations claims that are on other people's land, and that can potentially, especially as we've seen the embrace in certain places of top-down reparation visions, can be used to increase tensions and violences, rhetorical and otherwise, between Black and indigenous people. And I think that's like what's happening in Brazil is, we have to think about not just here, the Americas in particular acute intensity, but all over the world. These are a major question. How do you, and I think part of it is understanding that outside of nativist, indigenous claims to territoriality are not necessarily always inviting. I'm not saying that it should just be like, we all can come, but it is about how you approach and steward the land and not necessarily about blood quantum. So I think that's what I would say, that we have to engage in a lot of translation work, a lot of messy, complicated genealogies of violence, um, and begin to unpack those in dialogue. And I think the land is actually the way to do that. If we take it off the question of the land, what we actually might share is an appreciation for a particular place. What we might share is actually a particular like understanding of that stewardship that's a point of translation over trying to just like resolve this in discourse or politically or otherwise without actually the physical reference of the land. So I think the land is critical to some sort of like workable resolution of those questions. So not like as the future of it, but like a part of it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, because those questions have definitely come up for me as I'm thinking through and learning about solidarity, past, present, future. So yeah, I'm gonna sit with what you talked about and what work around Black Indigenous solidarity in relationship to the land. What does that look like, and what is it going to look like moving forward? All right, so we don't have any more questions coming in. I'm going to give folks a few minutes. If there's anyone still formulating a question, you can still add it to the Q&A. And in the meantime, I just want to lift up some of the links in the chat. So I shared the link to the Black Ecologies Lab, where you can find more information on the lab, JT's work, and also the zine that was mentioned a few times throughout the conversation. And then Jayana also shared a form that you can fill out and give some thoughts and feedback on MXGM and this Black Ecology series. So definitely please take some time to check those links out and give some more insight onto how you were feeling in response to the conversation. Yes, and Gianna just put it again. So definitely let us know what you're thinking. And thank you for everyone who dropped questions and engaged throughout the experience. So, okay, so we have one more question that came in. This is also from Al Brooks. Okay, so they're saying, this might be too big of a question to answer here, but talking about the Congo, they recently discovered a mine with 25% of the world's lithium. Given what's going on with the war, cobalt slavery, local government corruption, and Chinese and Western imperialism, what is a Black ecology vision for the resources of resource-rich nations? Should the resources stay in the land? Does any human have a right to mine land, even the people who live there? Or can those resources be a basis for a revolution in power relations away from traditional exploitation towards Congolese or Pan-African self-determination?
This is a phenomenal question. I think, I would be taking on too much for me to give a definitive answer, but I think at this level, and at this moment, just a baseline political education collectively around these the particular ways that Chinese and Western imperialism and their desire for extraction in what is basically an equivalent of the the Amazon in terms of like forest wise, like the second probably most important forest in in the global context, is being threatened. And I think also it's complicated. We've all been brought into the understanding of the ways that like the timeline of Western developmentalism, that makes it very difficult and would be foolhardy for me to tell people who are at a particular place in the overall racist political economy of global capitalism to be like, oh well, don't dig up don't dig that up. um but I do think we're collectively threatened by that process. That's one thing that these kinds of um the kind of insurgent work around climate emergency and all that can do is also having us understand the reality that clearing the forest here is also clearing the forest everywhere. um I don't have a simple or straightforward answer, because I think um people's capacities to thrive and to live like in harmony with the earth are so distorted by what currently exists that it's hard to really imagine a vision where you don't have to pluck something new out of the ground to create a potential otherwise trajectory. So I think, so I think our role, at least in this context, and at least now, is even just to spread a baseline vision that Chinese and U.S. imperialisms are are the culprits, in this context, um, are the culprit and are the culprits across multiple contexts, and I think that's the work of, like, if we're in the belly of the beast of disruption and possibility for direct action might be better suited to help to end the force that is the extractive force, um, rather than coming in with a relationship or not a relationship with Congolese people and saying y'all shouldn't do this or y'all should do that or whatever else, would be to just help end the demand for all of that in the first place. And I think that is in our wheelhouse and capacity is like Black liberation organizers who have been working in this context of the Americas. That is part of that's what we can do right here and right now. Um, so I think a Black ecologies analysis just off the top is really like, how do we not yeah, how do we not see somebody else's stuff as as ours, right? Like that, like as a baseline. What the histories of slavery and all that tell us about that not being a good framework, like as a straight up like just like baseline for cessation around growth and all these other cancerous ideologies that will kill us and then eventually the people that lead it. So
Yeah, I'm still sitting with, this question, and I appreciate your response, JT. And I think, the political moment that we're witnessing right now with a lot of the consciousness raising around these transnational connections, I feel like that provides us with a lot of fertile ground to continue engaging with this question. And I think a lot of the questions that folks brought up, and that we explored today, we're going to continue to come back to them in the series and beyond. So I really appreciate all that we been able to cover, the ground that we covered today, and looking forward to continuing to explore all of this with folks. So I'm not. Oh, there's one more question that came in to the Q&A. So Isaiah is asking, are there any past examples of efforts of land freeing action and organization from imperialism and colonialism around breaking binaries of colonization that it that still that it so any recommended authors that speak to those things?
yeah, this is a great question. I think, again, coming out of my own, you know, openness to to ongoing political education and knowing that there are limits to what I know has brought me into Haitian studies recently. And I think, um, you know, uh, Grace Sanders' book, Grace Sanders Johnson, her recent book about feminism in that context, but also some of the kind of, which is White Gloves, Black Nation is the title. Um, to Dupoy, and some others who I think also Trujillo's Haiti's State Against Nation is a critical one, for thinking about these kind of histories and the ways that um, extractive violence has shaped the contemporary sort of world, but also like resistances. I think Cabral is a major point of study for thinking about reimagining urban and rural land, and all those kinds of questions. I think many of the with the messiness and the complications, many of the Southern African liberation movements in Angola and Mozambique and South Africa are vital for study. And I'm saying all this with the caveat that I haven't studied these all closely enough, but I'm just remarking on other moments. I think what happens in I think the experiments in Tanzania, with urban and rural reformulations of villages and all of that under the leftist government, you know, are critical points of study, not of necessarily a replication, but of like what have people tried and what's going well and what hasn't, and what part of that was Western colonial violence and what part of that is like internal contradictions. Those are all things that we should be asking of a lot of places. And I will also say, I think what's going on in Brazil right now is critical. I think what's going on in places that may not be directly in the diaspora in the same kind of explicit, like recent connection is important. You know, I think Hawaiian indigenous sovereignty work is critical for thinking about when they got to Hawaii, they mobile or in the Philippines and other places, the U.S. mobilized the metaphor of these people are like the Negro, right? And that come with material and rhetorical force. That is an articulation that brings us together, even if we don't have a direct relationship to each other in the same kind of way that we're talking about through the Atlantic slave trade. So I think we have to. There are all kinds of and I also think just reinterpreting our own history is critical. I think every slave rebellion, with the knowledge that slavery is foundational to the ecocidal, genocidal complex that we still live with, every attempt to burn down a plantation was a alternative ecological vision. You know, I think we need to go back through civil rights and Black Power histories to really understand that if we're even at liberal civil rights, when we're contesting infrastructures, that we're also still there's an interface there between human socialities and earthly metabolisms that we need to think more about. So I think and maybe we haven't won none of that shit, but it's worth understanding the small ways that we have lived and come up with new modalities as a way of thinking how we project a possibility.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for all of the uh naming of resources, and that reminds me, as part of this event, we are putting together a resource document because again, we talked a lot about various things. So for folks, it'll be helpful to have a lot of these, recommendations and resources to continue exploring, beyond the event. And just want to lift up Baba Kwame's comment in the chat about how we have work to do collectively. And then Al Brooks said, that they appreciate the radical potential of holding the foundational principles of Black ecology, even without specific prescriptions, which is part of the principles. And okay, cool. So yeah, we got y'all with the resource document, and um, in that spirit, I definitely just want to thank you, JT, for the abundance of perspective and knowledge that you shared today and just spending your time with us. And I hope folks enjoyed, the Black Ecologies part 2 today. And, definitely again, leave some more thoughts in the form that Jayana shared in the chat, and there were some other resources shared throughout. So just, yeah, definitely take a minute to engage with all of that. And then, we can continue doing the work that folks are talking about in the chat and that we've mentioned here today. So yeah, definitely, again, want to emphasize the gratitude. Thank you, JT. And we can now close out with the event. And definitely for folks that joined, make sure to stay tuned on, the next part of the series.